Without further ado, Peder, thank you for jumping on and doing the extraordinary to make sure that we could have your presence. Everybody, welcome to the breakout session for the FOSI 2020 annual conference. Our breakout session is entitled Privacy, Policy, and Practice. I guess we're the catch-all session for everything that could happen, but we're the great catch-all session, so you're lucky you're here. I have the all-star panel, and my job is mostly to prompt them and then get out of the way. My name is Tim Sparapani. I have been a privacy practitioner for, I guess 2 decades now, and have been fortunate enough to be associated with FOSI for its entire existence. If you are not a FOSI member, please, I always give this pitch. What are you doing? Sign up now. Go out as fast as you can and support the organization. I'm so glad you're here today. And would like to very briefly just introduce by name only our 4 panelists today. And then I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. And what they're going to do is, I hope, begin by introducing our panel by mentioning what's different this year. We've had a year unlike any other. But what I thought we would do is kick it off for all of our audience by talking about what's different with respect to privacy practice this year. What's changed specifically with respect to the work that our 4 panelists have done and what they're experiencing and what their various organizations or companies are experiencing that's different. And I think what we'll do is we'll begin with Peder in just a moment from the Federal Trade Commission. So in no particular order, I will begin with Peder Magee, longtime staffer at the Federal Trade Commission. He's worn many hats there, and he will tell you about all of them. Peder is leading the COPPA review, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act review, which we'll talk about a good bit during this session. Gina Woodworth at SNAP, again, known to many of you, has played many important roles in this discussion. Amelia Vance, is there anybody who knows more about educational privacy in the country? If so, please find that person for me. But Amelia is the one we all turn to. And Giuga, who has joined us graciously from Lego. Would love to hear some of her perspective and what's happening with her very important company. Thank you, Carolina, for your daughter. My daughter has been entertained endlessly the last 9 months because of your toys. It's about the only thing that has satisfied her in recent times. So thank you. As a parent, you've saved me. So without further ado, maybe Peder, you could kick us off and tell us what's different in your experience as a parent, as a staffer, and as somebody who's close to all these questions on privacy at the FTC in the children's space.
Sure. First, thanks so much for having me on the panel. And I got to say before I start talking that my comments today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the commission. So with that said, substantively, my work, and I think this is true for most of my colleagues at the FTC, has not changed a great deal. It's just like a lot of people were doing it from home since the middle of March. And in that respect, I consider myself extremely fortunate. Like everyone else, there are challenges. My daughter's doing her school online, and my wife and I are sharing the office space in the house. But it's fantastic to be able to work remotely, and the FTC has been great at getting its people equipped to do so. The commission has been doing some work that was necessitated by the pandemic. One of the things I'll talk about a little later is some of the consumer blogs that we put out in April, discussing and how COPPA applies in that context. Otherwise, my work these days is focused primarily on the COPPA rule review process, which we're in the middle of.
Great, thank you, Peder. Maybe Gina, we could turn to you next, and then Carolina next, and then finally Amelia.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. as Tim already introduced me, I'm the head of U.S. Public Policy at SNAP, and thrilled to be here today. Also a proud FOSI board member, but really excited to talk about such a critical issue like privacy. As Peder said, we maintain the same protections we had pre-COVID for all of our users. With regard to our practice of data minimization and offering users options as it relates to their data, like the Download My Data tool, and just the ephemeral nature of snaps. But I wanted to back up a little bit for those of you who may not be familiar with Snap, just give you a little sense of who we are. We're a camera company, and we believe that reinventing the camera represents the greatest way to improve the greatest way for people to communicate. And it's sort of, Snapchat is one of our products, which you obviously may be familiar with. It's really built on real friendships where members of the community feel sort of safe to express themselves and live in the moment, learn about the world, and have fun together. So as I said, privacy is a top priority for us at Snap. We know that trust is earned every time our users use Snapchat or any of our other products. And I can, I can get into more detail as we talk further, just about how our platform is architected a little bit differently and how we treat information at Snap. But looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Gina. Carolina, please tell us about Lego.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what's different.
Absolutely, Tim, and thank you I'm happy that your kids were entertained during this very difficult moment that we're all going through, and that Lego has been a part of your family activity.
Without question.
That's always great to hear. I think from a personal note on COVID, as a mom of a toddler, you can imagine how chaotic my house has been these past 10 months, but it is impressive how easily we do adapt to new realities. I'll start off before I talk about COVID, if you don't mind, Tim. I'll just, because I hope I have lots of Lego builders in the room today. But for those that don't know our digital portfolio, because it's a little less known, I just wanted to take a minute just to talk about that, especially because I am responsible for, one of the areas I'm responsible for is responsible digital engagement and how we engage online with children. I think I can't talk about our digital portfolio without talking about our long-standing partnership with UNICEF. 5 years ago, we started working with UNICEF on how to integrate the Convention on the Rights of the Child and Children's Rights and Business Principles into our business practice and products. So it is very much part of so it's beyond just privacy and safety. It is how do we put the child at the center of what we're developing in the digital as well as the physical products that we have. Just to illustrate, one of my favorite digital tools that we have, or digital products, is called Lego Life. Lego Life is a digital social network for kids and tweens. And as you can imagine, the audience for Lego is a much younger audience. So Lego Life is probably the first social network that they will be interacting. So what we see is an importance for when we're creating the product of not only baking in privacy and safety into the components of the design, but just how to create a safe environment for the child to interact. So one of the main features was the creation of a character called Captain Safety, and Captain Safety is a non-player character, and he walks kids through on what's appropriate behavior online. So they talk about, like, if you see something that just doesn't seem right, how do you report it? And this in a very child-friendly language. Or, just be nice. Like, make sure that when you're how you're talking to someone else is the same way that you would want to hear. So just very basic information on what it looks like to have what it looks like to, be a responsible online an online user. So I just wanted to give that little introduction. On COVID, a couple of interesting things that we have experienced these past 10 months is, in the beginning, there was just a lot of conversation on COVID digitally, which is not a surprise, but I think from our perspective, it's interesting to see how younger kids were talking about COVID. And it's just so adorable to see what they were focusing on. So there was a lot of encouraging others to wash their hands. So you see a lot of fans getting little mini figures and snapping photos of them, encouraging their friends to wash their hands, or just telling everyone, everything will be okay, rainbows of solidarity. A lot of memes about panic buying, which was really entertaining to see. And what was interesting is that this was not focused on one market or the other. This was globally, you were seeing the same message coming from kids, doesn't matter where they were based. The other trend that we saw these past, which we weren't expecting, was just how much of Lego building has become a pandemic activity. And not only a pandemic activity for your kids, but we've been seeing more and more adults doing it as a hobby, but more and more as a family activity. So seeing it as the same way that you might plan a movie night with your kids or a games night. Now you're seeing a lot of Lego building activity as one of those theme nights, as a family interaction and bonding activity. And then a lot of posting it online on your creations or just the activity itself. But more focused on privacy. I think our reflection is that the issues are not new. It's not new issues that we're dealing specifically this year. It's still the same issues that we've had in the past, but there isn't just a heightened interest. One that we weren't expecting is we've seen an increase in parents going through the VPC mechanism, which was not something that we were expecting to see. And as you know,
through the verifiable parental consent mechanism.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to translate for those who may not be familiar. I want to make sure that we're using the acronyms everybody knows.
Absolutely.
And you're speaking about COPPA specifically. So go ahead, Karen.
So VPC, or verifiable parental consent, it's that fundamental component of COPPA. It is the primary mechanism for brands like Lego to engage legally with children under 13. What we have experienced in the past is that to create an effective VPC mechanism that is robust enough and that a child won't circumvent, because kids are getting smarter by the minute, but at the same time does not disrupt the experience of going into a new service or a new product, is incredibly challenging. And how we've seen it is that we've always looked at it as the user familiarity and their willingness to go through VPC as a serious barrier to entry. So here we are creating a very safe space for kids to interact, and we worry that this might become, as a result, parents and children may well go into low barrier play experiences. And these might not have been designed with kids in mind or for that child's specific age. But I'll just stop there, just concluding that what we feel is that we've seen that because of the proximity between the child and the parent. They're inside the same home, and we feel that's one of the reasons why we've seen an increase. The question here, which I don't think we have an answer to, is if this trend is sustainable or not. So I'll stop by there because I talked a little bit too much.
That's great. No, thank you for that. Before we turn to Amelia for a little bit of what's been different this year, I neglected to do this as a moderator. First of all, if you're tweeting, please go ahead and tag us under hashtag FOSI 2020, please. A request from FOSI itself. Second, we are taking questions and they are being moderated. So feel free to go ahead and add your questions. We'll get to them. We've got about 10 minutes at the end reserved for questions for our fabulous panelists. So go ahead and file off those questions in the chat. We'll try to get to them as we get time at the end. Amelia, please tell us what's different about this year.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tim. So as mentioned, Amelia Vance, I'm the Director of Youth and Education Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. We're a nonprofit working on all sorts of consumer privacy issues. I think what we've seen this year was a surprising, I think to most people, focus and priority on privacy in both the child and student privacy space, as well as more broadly. Within days of most of the U.S. being shut down, there were a ton of tweets that went viral, news stories, et cetera, on how Zoom and privacy was going, how online learning and privacy was happening. You had guidance put out from the Department of Education on disclosing COVID diagnoses in schools. You had privacy surprisingly high because of course, school administrators and parents and journalists and policymakers had so many priorities this year that were just basic necessities: getting kids fed, making sure that kids were receiving an education, making sure that those who suddenly became unemployed were able to live, making sure that people, if they were sick, were getting help. And despite those absolutely essential priorities, privacy kept popping up and has continued popping up throughout the year again and again and again. And so we've partnered with organizations like ASA, the School Superintendents Association, to put out, an FAQ back in March, partnered with the National Center for Learning Disabilities to put out a publication in August about special ed and student privacy. Put out with about 25 organizations last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago now, a set of principles on student privacy and equity during the pandemic, focused on, not only some of the online learning questions, but also the back to school questions, the health scans and other technology that's being adopted to reopen schools and workplaces generally. And we've been getting a ton of questions that really pushed us to put out those resources from practitioners, from policymakers, including those who hadn't necessarily thought that much about child and student privacy before. And a lot of that is good. I'm glad that privacy is a value that is being pushed, because as we become more reliant on the internet, on digital resources, on software, it is vital that people feel that they can trust those spaces. And so these questions really indicate that, policymakers and others are interrogating that question. We've also had people raise where they're seeing barriers, where COVID has really highlighted issues. So Carolina mentioned verifiable parental consent, and we've had a lot of questions in the US and globally about what protections are necessary to enable kids to use the internet, which is so important right now, to have relationships outside your home without lying about their age, without, potentially having their parents go through that process, which can disadvantage kids whose parents are not available to do that. It's multi-steps for a reason. And so I think it means that, moving forward, we may see new policies, new practices, and continued focus on privacy, especially as we go into legislative sessions next year.
Thank you, Amelia. I can reflect as a practitioner. I've heard a tremendous amount about live video in homes and the pressures that is putting on all sorts of companies and educational technology providers, game developers, companies that just weren't set up to have live video in such an intensive way, and the privacy questions that are being raised both in the United States and around the world. And that's raising a lot of policymaker interest. So I will second that. We can come back to that a little bit later. Peder, I'm going to turn to you because there is a tremendous amount of interest in the community that FOSI speaks to about the COPPA review, which you are in the middle of. Maybe you could give people a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar with where the FTC is and why the FTC is reviewing COPPA at this stage, and where you stand and what should be expected in the coming year for those who are following this closely.
Sure, Tim. I'm happy to give a little background on the process and maybe highlight some of the big issues we're looking at. Last year, the Commission began a review of our COPPA rule. We do that periodically for all the rules the Commission has. The last time we looked at the rule was about 10 years ago, a little less, and the Commission made some changes to the rule that went into effect in 2013. We we moved up the timing on the review a little bit, just given how quickly technology and business models change and evolve, and that COPPA deals with the online collection of information. And in the online context, things change very quickly. That being said, these rule review processes take time. When we began the last one, I believe it started in 2011, and it wasn't finalized until 2013. So the timing is pretty consistent with our last go-round. So we announced this process last year, and we held a public workshop last October to discuss the rule and get some input into where how effective the rule was and where changes might be necessary. We also published a Federal Register notice regarding the review and asking for public comment on, I think, around 30 questions that we set forth. Things like whether the rule's keeping pace with new technologies and business models that rely on data collection. We asked how effective the 2013 amendments to the rule have been in protecting kids' privacy, and whether we needed to change any of the any aspects of those previous amendments. So the comment period closed, I believe, in December. We received a huge number of comments, over 170,000.
Just a couple.
Which staff has been diligently working on reviewing and analyzing. Some of the sort of topics that the comments, the big picture topics the comments have teed up are first dealing with definitions in the rule. What the definition of personal information. COPPA applies to a specific types of personal information that's collected from kids, and we've received comments on whether to expand the definition to include things like biometric data or inferred data. That inferred data would be information about children, but that wasn't necessarily collected from them. There are a lot of comments dealing with a change we made in 2013, which was to make persistent identifiers on their own personal information under the rule. And that change is what brought in, for the most part, the practice of behavioral advertising. A second area is also on definitions. It's the definition of website or online service directed to children. Whether the FTC uses a multi-factor test to make that determination, whether that test is appropriate and functions practically. There's also issues around the mixed audience category of sites and services, which is a subset of child-directed. Another issue is whether and how COPPA should treat sites and services that have not traditionally been thought of as being child-directed, but nevertheless may have large numbers of users who are children. Another issue is whether to codify in the rule an exception that the Commission has recognized for a while that allows operators to obtain consent from schools rather than parents in the educational context. And then finally, the issue about general audience platforms that feature content uploaded from third parties, and whether, if such content is child-directed, there are any ways for the platform to rebut COPPA's presumption that any user that's using or interacting with a child-directed site or service is necessarily a child. So I think, again, tremendous number of comments and interest in the area. We're going through it. Those are some of the big picture issues we're analyzing. And it's a process. I can't really give a whole lot of insight into when or what the specific next steps will be, other than to say that we are in the middle of it right now.
That's tremendously helpful, Peder. Just a personal plea, as you've heard from me again, please do something about the VPC mechanisms. Try to update them. Amelia, Gina, Carolina, are there comments about the COPPA review that you'd like to share with Peder from your communities, things that you want to highlight?
So Peder is very aware of that since they highlighted some of these things at the workshop held last October. Highly encourage folks in the audience to watch the recording of that workshop. I think it really highlights in detail what are some of the key issues that are up here and sort of how do they impact specific communities. But the COPPA rule review is really just one of a number of massive changes to child privacy and student privacy questions in the US and all over the world. We have new child privacy protections in GDPR, including, well, no longer associated with the EU, the UK's age-appropriate design code, which is deeply, deeply based in GDPR and could very easily carry over to the US. You have multiple states enacting new child privacy protections, most apparent being the California Consumer Privacy Act, and now its follow-up, the ballot initiative that passed a few weeks ago, which also has new privacy protections. So stay tuned. I am betting with turnover in the administration and other things, it's very possible we see a federal bill or a very different state child privacy landscape before we actually have a COPPA, a new COPPA rule.
And I do want to get to that state legislation here in just a minute. Carolina and Gina, any comments on COPPA or the review before we talk about the age-appropriate design code?
Yeah, if you don't mind me just adding to what Amelia said, I think that one of my wish lists is hopefully to get bipartisan support to pass a federal privacy law. But one of my concerns is if there is no agreement and legislators feel that they need to push for something in the privacy space, that it be on child privacy, it just being a low-hanging fruit. I do feel the LEGO group feels very strongly about COPPA. I think FTC has created a policy that is non-prescriptive. It has proven that it is future-proof, and I just would love to continue seeing it as, you know, the national preemptive regime that governs this space. So I just wanted to add that additional comment.
Just echo, you know, the need for a comprehensive sort of federal privacy bill, and I know that, you know, so many of us have been thinking about what that would look like. And one thing, you know, as we continue to think about, I think, children's privacy, one thing that we want to, I think, just caution against is just that the end result isn't collecting more data, which would seem, you know, counter to data minimization. And that's an inherent principle of privacy and consumer protection from the very, you know, in the beginning. So we just wouldn't want to see that be the end result.
Right. One of the things that's new for this year, and which is going to be tremendously influential, I think, going forward, and I think our panelists agree with this based on our conversation before this panel while we were preparing to speak with you all, is the issue of the age-appropriate design code emanating from the UK. While FOSI principally, you know, is based in the United States, it has a worldwide audience, and I'm watching people join our conversation from literally all over the globe right now, and that's really heartening. This design code has a chance to be quite influential, in that it is a series of guideposts for developers about things that they need to build in to each and every bit of their code and the UI, and therefore the UX around the products and services they're offering online. Do any of our speakers want to describe the age-appropriate design code a little bit more fulsomely, and then talk about what they think its influence might be? And then maybe talk about whether or not they expect to see pieces of it picked up and perhaps added to laws or regulations here in the United States.
So I'm happy to a quick introduction, and then very interested to hear from Carolina and Gina on this, since I know companies are now in a one-year period starting September this year through September in 2021 to adhere to the age-appropriate design code if they have a presence in the UK. So the code is based in the idea that children should be able to be online and have protections no matter where they are, with the exception of clearly adult-aimed sites. It's really, from what I understand, based on research that shows that worldwide, 1 in 5 kids is online and actively using the internet. And when it comes to countries in Europe, the US, et cetera, it's actually 1 in 3 kids. And so it's really focused on kids not as a segment of an audience, but really focused on kids more broadly in many ways than COPPA, using general audience sites. And so the code includes many things that are built sort of fundamentally into privacy by design and other frameworks from the UN, from GDPR, like age-appropriate application. So considering the needs of children of different ages, transparency, not using children's data in ways that have been shown to be detrimental to their well-being, having high privacy by default settings, data minimization, geolocation options off by default, no profiling, no nudge techniques, et cetera, et cetera. I stuck a couple links in a really great infographic that summarizes a lot of the elements of the code, but it also raises a lot of questions. So the United States in particular has some legal cases from back in the 90s when, the internet was starting to spread, where you had a lot of policymakers who put into place really, really strong sort of assuming children were online barriers to those children being able to access certain websites with the expectation that there was going to be inappropriate content. And those protections were overruled by the Supreme Court. They violated the First Amendment. And so when we look at a code like this that assumes that you have a child accessing the site, it would be difficult to carefully craft it in a way in the United States that it would be difficult to assume that everyone is a child, and if they are not, they have to prove otherwise, because if you orient websites in that way, you're likely running into free speech issues. And so companies are, if they're in the UK, they don't have a First Amendment in the way that we do. And so certainly they'll have to adhere to it in the UK, possibly in Europe more fully. If you read the full age-appropriate design code, the UK actually links it very specifically to GDPR. So it would be very easy without an individual country's legislature adopting it for them to just lay it on top of their GDPR compliance. But the US would have to have a very carefully tailored variation of it if it was going to be adopted here. it's possible it might be. We have the Washington State Consumer Privacy Act, which has been introduced for a few years now and is more akin to GDPR than the California Consumer Privacy Act. So it's possible that the child privacy protections from GDPR could follow along, and therefore the age-appropriate design code. But it's really tough in the US, and there are a lot of legitimate questions about how much of a barrier you're creating to make the entire internet in a way child-friendly, and therefore precluding adults from accessing certain content without going through a big sort of age screening device. But it'll be really interesting to see exactly how it's adopted.
I think it's really interesting. I say this as a lawyer and without taking a position on any of this. The extraterritorial effects of the first, to my mind, user interface code will be really interesting. I know that Australia had discussed this, 10 years ago, and to see the UK sort of put this in place will be interesting to see how influential it is, and whether it balkanized just to the UK or just to Europe, and whether companies put this in place sort of globally in the same way that GDPR has been easier to implement for some companies on a sort of a multinational basis. Carolina, Gina, do you want to comment on this? Peder, do you want to talk about whether anyone at the FTC is thinking about these questions? I'll start maybe with Carolina and Gina.
Yeah, absolutely. I can start off. I think that this issue, I'll just go back to the title of this panel. It's policy and practice. And I think that for us practitioners in the area of public policy, we have experienced that sometimes policies on paper, there's a gap between when you're trying to comply and when you're trying to put it into practice. I think that the UK design code, there are a lot of sections that we are incredibly supportive, and we did share our support during our comments. So for example, having a standard where you're putting the best interests of the child at the center of when you're designing a product, I think that is exactly how, if a company is interacting in the child space, that should exactly be the focus. The other ones, we're still in that moment where we need to test it out, and now we're going to start identifying what are the challenges of actually implementing the standards here. So I feel like it's a little too soon because we're still going through the process, but I can see that there will be certain gaps in terms of implementing some of these standards.
Gina, did you want to make any comment?
Very similar, I think, to Carolina. I think there are some really good, pieces like the transparency piece and data minimization and promoting sort of flexibility through privacy by design and privacy risk assessments. But yeah, as Carolina said, it's a living process. So we're still going through.
Peder, do you think this will hasten an age estimation? I'm sorry, Gina, I didn't mean to talk over you, please.
Nope, nothing.
Yeah, Peder or others, do you think this will hasten an age estimation regime in the United States?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I am very intrigued to see how, well, first, I think the design code has, by incorporating concepts that the FTC and others have advocated for quite some time, things like privacy and security by design, increasing transparency and such. Those are great concepts. It will be interesting to see how companies come into compliance with it. And I don't really have a prediction on what the sort of downstream effects will be from that. I mean, I guess if at some point everyone is complying with that, then that sort of becomes the de facto standard.
Great. Reminder to all in our audience that we're going to be taking questions in about 5 minutes. So please put those in the chat, and we'll try to get to those if you have them for our panelists. I know there is great interest from our audience to hear from the panelists in terms of their prognostication about both U.S. state and U.S. federal privacy legislation and regulation. So this is a free-for-all here, folks. People want to talk about both what they want to see and what they expect to see. Let's start maybe with the state. Well, maybe let's do this. Maybe we'll do the federal level first, given the change in administration that's forthcoming. Anybody want to jump in? Maybe Gina, you want to start out first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, at both the state and federal level, we've seen activity. Less so, of course, this year when it comes to more comprehensive federal privacy. We saw quite a few proposals at the end of last year in the Commerce Committee, especially. The Senate Commerce Committee has taken the lead. So Chairman Wicker had a bill, and Senator Cantwell also had a bill. There were several different proposals, and I think that as we go into next year, no matter who has control of the Senate, I do believe that we are going to see federal privacy be taken up, because this year what we did see in the states is continued activity. And Amelia can probably speak to this much better than me when it comes to specifics. But as she said, Senator Carlisle had his bill in Washington State, and it's been a continued conversation for a while. There's conversation going on in Oregon with the AG to talk a little bit about a privacy bill there. I believe now they've decided to hold off next year and talk about a bill in 2022. And then we've seen some activity in New York State and Illinois. So I think as you continue to see states talking about these issues, that'll put pressure on Congress to, come up with a federal solution, because I don't think it would be ideal to have a patchwork of state laws for anyone.
Yeah,
Carolina?
I'd like to echo everything that Gina said. I agree 100%. Hopefully we will see some movement on the federal side, or the states will continue to put pressure and make it more challenging, again, going back to the policy to practice, from a company perspective, making it incredibly challenging to comply with this patchwork of framework. Maybe another, so not on the privacy piece, but I think it's very important, and what we're looking forward to in this new administration is to see some agreement, some decision on global data flow, especially from the US and the EU after the Schrems II decision. I think that's also another barrier for companies operating at a global level, and would love to see that coming into fruition for the next coming years.
Amelia, where do you see particularly state level activity, and do you see any federal level activity, especially in the educational privacy context? We've never had a year like this. Everybody's doing distance learning. They have to. We're going to see more lockdowns, I suspect, in the coming weeks. Heaven forbid, but I think we're there. Yeah. Major school districts around the country are closing down once again. I think Chicago's on the precipice if they haven't already closed down. New York is right there. Others are about to close down once again. So please, Amelia, where do you think it's happening? And it's particularly in the educational privacy context, and to the extent that that's influential for the broader privacy context. Maybe you can talk about the particular and then broaden out as
Absolutely. Well. So child privacy broadly, starting there, I think we're closer to, or more likely to see something, I should say, pass when it comes to either a COPPA extension, a COPPA rewrite, something child privacy related at the federal level than we've been over the past, 5, 10, 20 years. So that is something that I'll be watching really closely. If it does happen, it's more likely that it would come about as part of that sort of federal consumer privacy legislation, either a piece of that or along with it, if a bill does not include a child privacy section. And what we've sort of looked at, and I shared a link in the chat that compares sort of the state side of this, but it also applies federally, is that we're likely to see at least some of the trends worldwide reflected in that. So an extension of the age of protection beyond 13, more potential restrictions on how the data can be used, possibly moving away from a parental consent model and more towards a use limitation model. But it really depends on, as always, who's writing the legislation. On the student privacy side, definitely think that we'll at least see things introduced. We've gotten so many questions from folks in Congress and elsewhere about student privacy protections when it comes to facial recognition, when it comes to online learning generally, just asking, what is the existing law here? Is there a law? And then they're always shocked when I'm like, yes, there's about 3 federal laws and over 130 state laws. There's a lot. Please be careful. There's a lot of layers here already. So I do think that we'll at least see a FERPA rewrite introduced. FERPA was already due to have new substantial regulations put into place. Supposed to be last year and then this year. I think earliest would probably be March or April in 2021.
And for our international audience, we're talking about the Family Educational Rights
Act,
and
yes.
Privacy Act, which governs schools and districts in the United States that receive federal funds. I just want to translate for everybody. Go ahead, please, Amelia.
And so those regulations, it's possible since they were written primarily by civil servants, but certainly occurred during the Trump administration, that you could see an interest in rewriting them from the Biden administration. But very possible that those will come out, since they weren't randomly brought up. They're based in a Department of Education Inspector General report from 2018 now that criticized how complaints were dealt with under FERPA, and said that there were several years-long outstanding complaints that could not be resolved without some sort of clarification in FERPA's regulations. So federally, it's going to probably be a bit of a mess. Hopefully, again, adding protections as opposed to adding layers of compliance that don't actually help protect kids. On the state side, you have, as I said, child privacy provisions in a lot of the state bills introduced on child privacy. I dropped our comparison of California's state law, to be clear, CCPA, not CIPRA. So it's a little out of date now, but, and the last iteration of Washington State's consumer privacy bill, and what the child privacy differences are in the chat. And likely we'll see bills like that all over the country, as well as standalone child privacy bills, as well as, again, student privacy bills, because there's so much of a focus on online learning and concern about the use of ed tech. Parents are able to sit next to their kids in many cases and see exactly how much ed tech is being used, and not necessarily knowing if there are privacy protections associated. To be clear, there are. But it's definitely going to lend itself to a bit of chaos in the state legislative sessions that kick off in January.
All right, 2 rapid fire polls of all of our panelists. And Peder, I know that you may not be able to participate, and you say so if you can't. Let's go around the circle here. We'll do yes, no's here. Yes or no, do we think that there will be, at this point next year, a federal consumer privacy law that has been enacted? I'm starting with Gina, and Peder will come to you last if you can participate. Gina, then Carolina, then Amelia. Yes or no? At this point, a year from now, we're sitting here, will there be a consumer privacy law passed at the federal law level of any kind?
Of any kind. Doesn't have to be comprehensive.
Of any kind. Doesn't have to be.
I'm hopeful.
That's a plausible maybe. Okay, Carolina, yes.
That's what
yes
I was
or
going
no?
to say. I'm feeling hopeful today, so I'll go with yes.
Okay. Amelia, what do you got? Yes or no?
No, if you ask me 2 years from now, I might be a yes, but.
Okay. Peder, are you allowed to answer this question, yes or no?
Perhaps, and that's going to be my answer on prediction. But Tim, if I could just take 1 second, because
Sure, please.
It has come up, I think, and it's related to what we're talking about, obviously. In April, the commission issued 2 blogs on COPPA and remote learning that I think that I'd just like to highlight. They've got some really good information in there for educators, for operators, and for parents. They can be found on the FTC's website. They talk about how COPPA applies, questions schools should ask in picking ed tech, questions parents should ask if they're picking ed tech outside of the school context. And it also has some links to some very good information on the FTC website to parents about talking to their kids, how to be safe online. So I just want to highlight those. I think they're very relevant to what's going on now with everyone dealing with remote learning, and would urge people to take a look at them.
I will add my thanks for those. I was citing to them just yesterday for 2 clients, Peder. I think they're fabulous resources. And so I will add my thanks for the broader community of COPPA users and people who read this. So thank you. I commend them to people as well. Another quick question. We have 3 minutes. We're going to wrap up. So we're going to do one more round of predictions and then 1 minute very quickly, or 30 seconds each, on predictions for what's coming next year. Here's the question. How many state-level bills of consumer privacy will be enacted by this point next year? You have to pick a number. It can be 0. Again, we're going to start with Gina. We're sitting here a year from now. How many state-level consumer privacy bills will have been enacted by a year from now, FOSI 2021?
1.
Carolina.
I'm being very hopeful. If I want my life to be easier, I hope it's 1 as well.
Amelia, what do you got?
10 to 15.
Amelia, don't do that.
Yeah, I'm going to
us.
say 6 or 7. I'm going to say 6 or 7. I'm weighing in too. Peder, you care to weigh in? Can you weigh in on this one?
I'm not going to weigh in on the predictions.
Okay. With just 2 minutes left, can we go quickly through desires for next year? Gina, you get 20 to 30 seconds about what you'd love to see happen next year. And we're going to go Gina, Carolina, Amelia, and then Peder in that direction.
I'd love to, and I know I said this before, but I'd love to see some, productive work on a federal privacy solution that incorporates a lot of the aspects that we've talked about today: transparency, privacy by design, just again, like making sure that we don't have a patchwork of state laws, creating maybe a uniform standard for data breach notification. So having some of these really key principles looked at on the federal side would be great. And just before, I also wanted to just add quickly that, in this time right now, we did just recently launch a new and updated Parents Guide to Snapchat. I'd encourage everyone to look at it. I know that, more people are at home, and they are with their children too. So it's great that parents and kids can work together. And so we've really updated this guide to make it a lot more, I think, readable for parents. So take a look. I'll link it in the chat.
Will you please, Carolina, your turn.
I think I mentioned during today's panel a lot of my wish list for next year. I think one of the areas that I didn't talk, which is a pity. I wish we had more time so we could dive a little bit deeper, is just on the education on parents and children. This is an area where I think great work is being done. I think we still have a lot to do, and I think that, Peder, I'm glad that you mentioned the blog posts, and because I think that's a very important resource. It's also a very important role of the FTC to continue to educate parents and children. I do believe that everyone in this ecosystem plays a role in educating users. We're living in a world, the digital ecosystem is very fragmented, so it does require all of us to work together on an approach to empower, to educate parents and users, but also empower our future digital citizens.
At the risk of offending Amelia and Peder, we are at time.
Thanks so much, Tim.
So, well, I want to thank our audience. I especially want to thank my panelists, who are, again, the all-star cast. And I want to thank the audience for participating this last hour. Enjoy the rest of the day at FOSI's 2020 annual conference, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.